There are so many resources on how to plot a book, but if you try to get into how to plot a trilogy or a series, you go from having a ton of information to having almost none. Almost no one talks about how to plot a trilogy or a series. I have written 9 completed 3 to 4 book series, and I'm working on 2 more trilogies as we speak. So I've gone through it, and I think I've learned some things along the way that I can share with you guys. First, I'm going to talk about my general tips for writing trilogies. I'm going to focus mainly on trilogies because that's like the most common length, but I will discuss longer series a little bit as well. After I've given you my general tips, I'm going to talk in a little more detail about some of the trilogies I've completed. I'm going to try to stay away from like a lot of spoilers, but there will be a few spoilers for some of my completed trilogies. So if you're planning on reading them and you don't want spoilers, then skip that part. Many of you probably know the 3-act structure used to plot a book, which is the setup, confrontation, and resolution. And it might sound a little obvious, but it was not immediately obvious to me that when you're thinking about plotting a trilogy, you're kind of thinking about a broader sense of the 3-act structure. The first book is usually a little more of a setup book, but then you would have a 3-act structure or some kind of story plotting structure within each novel in the trilogy. So the first book, the characters are all getting together, they're getting to know each other. Your protagonist is going to have a confrontation and resolution with the first problem, but then at the end of the book, you might twist it a little. Rather than thinking of the second book as confrontation, I might think of that as evolution of the confrontation from the first book. Whatever the first confrontation is, the second book ups the stakes, brings in a new conflict that is related to but different from the conflict in the first book. And then in the third book, you're going to begin the process of tying all of that together and confronting what is the ultimate struggle of the trilogy. So I usually start by thinking of one big, broad, overarching scenario for the entire trilogy. Like currently I'm working on the potion dealers, and I know that my main character's ultimate goal is to become one of the top bosses in the magical organized crime families, but to do it on his own terms. So that's like my what drives the whole series. But then each book within that series is going to be a piece of accomplishing this rather large goal, and different antagonists, whether internal or external, that he will have to get through along with the rest of the character group along the way. If this sounds like a lot to think about, an exhausting amount of things to think about, you're right, it is. This is a bit of a long haul writing a trilogy or a series. Just sitting down to plot it alone can take me months in some cases. Sometimes it comes together fast, or sometimes I don't really plot it at all, but sometimes it's like an arduous process. And then, of course, writing it is a long haul. Something I've really incorporated into my daily routine is Magic Mind. Magic Mind is a mental performance shot that includes a little bit of caffeine with matcha, but more importantly to me, it includes a host of other safe ingredients that help to give me a sustained, calm energy throughout the day. And this has really become a part of my daily writing routine when I know that I'm going to be sitting down doing some heavy thinking for hours. Kicking the whole thing off with a Magic Mind shot, I really have noticed a difference over time, especially in how well I'm able to concentrate over long periods and not slump into like that afternoon drag. And it's also been great for when I need to switch tasks and do several different things in a day, which I can really struggle with, but I've noticed that I've been a little better at being like nimble mentally with doing like a YouTube video, writing, a load of laundry, and a little cleaning all in one day. I am such a fan of this stuff. Their sleep elixir has also been great for just settling down into a nice calm sleep. I really recommend Magic Mind for creative who are struggling with your focus. And if you'd like to try Magic Mind for yourself, risk-free, my code FOXGLOVE20, that's FOXGLOVE20, gets you up to 48% off on a subscription. So make sure to check that link in the description and give it a try. Let me know how it goes for you. One thing about plotting a trilogy is that if you are the kind of person who normally leans a little more toward the plotting side of things than winging it, you might have to accept a certain level of winging it as you're looking into the future. Some people can plot an entire trilogy or series in detail before they sit down to write a single word, but that is definitely not most of us. Even if you're someone who can plot one entire book in detail, you might struggle to foresee an entire trilogy all in one go. So you have to kind of take on a certain level of trust that you're going to figure it out as you go. Just keep that one primary overarching plot goal in mind. I can't tell you how many times I've been writing a series and things just click together in a way that's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I actually set that up so well and I didn't even intend for this to turn out like that. Like things that you might think that your favorite writer meticulously plotted in detail before sitting down to write might have actually been something that they just figured out as they were going. One debate when it comes to trilogies: should you end the book on a cliffhanger? It definitely helps to sell the next book in the series if you leave off, hi, hello, without everything just like all tied up. Now, there's somewhat like people use cliffhanger somewhat interchangeably with just like the story isn't over yet. A cliffhanger is supposed to literally be like you left a character hanging on a cliff or something similar, but some readers will complain this book ended in a cliffhanger and it's more like not a literal cliffhanger. So everybody kind of has their own definition now of what a cliffhanger actually is. But I've definitely seen better sales of my trilogies when I kind of wrap up the conflicts of the first book, but then I throw in a new thing that's like, oh my God, how are they going to get through this one? Just when you thought A was wrapped up, now B just entered the room. If you don't have something like that, then you have to trust that readers are going to just keep reading because they loved the characters, that you did not end them with some thrilling plot that isn't resolved yet. And that is a little more of a risk, but it also just kind of depends on the type of book you're writing. Now, if you are writing a trilogy, but it's also part of a larger series, I've had multiple interconnected trilogies, and that's also what I'm working on now. I do think it's good if you have some little threads that cross between your trilogies, something to make people think, oh, I might want to read the next series as well to see what happened to this side character or how this, political plot resolves. I would wrap up everything, all the main characters in the trilogy that you're writing. You want them to all have good, happy endings. You want the reader to feel like they could stop reading and that would be satisfying. I think it gets very irritating to readers when they're sort of forced to keep reading a massive series and it never ends. You can get fatigue if it feels like there's never a good point to just stop. Now, that can, of course, help book sales, like in a larger sense, but personally, I would not write a trilogy that also has a massive cliffhanger for the next series. I've also found with trilogies, the more involved that you get, I've had to change my plot methods a lot, and I've also made outlines that I thought sounded really good, but then when I started to write them, they did not work at all. I don't think I've ever written an outline for a trilogy where I actually executed it exactly as intended. So much as you might struggle to really write a detailed outline for the whole trilogy, even if you do, you might have to accept that some things are going to change because you're just writing so much and so many things are going to evolve. One problem with writing trilogies and series is that you might get a little bored with what you're writing, and sometimes your readers might too. So when I'm planning a trilogy, I often plan ways to mix it up a little. For example, book 2 brings them to a new location, or in book 3, I introduce a new point of view character with their own little side plot that ties into the main plot, but they have their own little arc. So some of the ways that you might want to plan to keep a trilogy fresh are new point of view, a new couple if you're writing books with romantic elements, a new antagonist, a new setting. And if it's not already clear, when I'm talking about writing trilogies and series here, I'm not talking about standalones that fall into the same series or like more episodic type things like a long mystery series where each one has a different mystery. I'm talking about like a big overarching plot line, such as you'd see in like epic fantasy, romantasy, sci-fi epics, space opera, a lot of those genre fiction trilogies like that. So those are like my broad tip. Now let me get into a little bit about some of my individual trilogies and some of the different ways that I plotted them and the different ways that I got myself through to writing a whole trilogy. My career started in young adult traditional publishing, and my first book was acquired as a standalone, but my editor said that she was open to a sequel and she wanted me to leave the ending like open for sequel, like not tie everything up. The first book did not really serve as a standalone because I did as she asked, but the publisher did not acquire the sequel until after they saw how the first book did, and it ended up being 2 books in that series. Then my second young adult series was acquired as a duology right off the bat. And in the case of the first book, I had originally thought of it with series potential, but when it came to the second book, I had not thought about series potential at all. And then they were like, oh, we wanted a sequel. So I struggled enormously with that duology. That was Dark Metropolis and Glittering Shadows, because I had nothing as far as what the second book was going to be. It was probably the worst experience of my entire publishing career. But then in 2016, I moved into indie publishing, and then I could do whatever I wanted. So I do really like a trilogy that's planned as a trilogy from the very beginning, and I like series with a lot of interconnected books. I grew up reading a lot of Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar books, so I had always dreamed of writing something like that, where you have many trilogies and they all interconnect, and there'll be references to characters from previous books in the next series, but you could jump in pretty much anywhere. That was really what I wanted to do. So I wrote the Cursed Soul trilogy, which was set in the fantasy world I've been writing about since I was a kid. This was my first trilogy, and you can see my plan for the series right in the titles. It was the Sorcerer's Concubine, the Sorcerer's Wife, and the Sorcerer's Equal. So there's the progression rather unsubtly laid out in the titles. Part of the reason I did that is because at the time it seemed like books that were like, well, actually this is still kind of true, but like include some kind of like dominating relationship dynamic, like, you know, the demon's captive or something like that were hot. So I was like, oh, I want to get in on that trend, but I also wasn't really going to write a book that was just like a dominating paranormal romance. So I tried to indicate like it's going to start this way, and then by the end it's going to be the Sorcerer's Equal. This was my very poor understanding of the indie publishing and the romance market talking, but whatever, it worked. People bought it. And this series did flow out just really easily, actually. I plotted it somewhat. I had kind of like a 1-page beat sheet of what was going to happen for each book. It was somewhat just organically evolving as I wrote, and I kind of just let the characters lead the way into what the plot would be. But I did have that plan from the start that it was going to start out with the main character is from my race of doll people that were created as slaves, and she is purchased by the sorcerer who, although she was intended to be like a concubine, he's more curious about like the magic that created her, and is like takes one look at her and realizes that there's like more to her than he was told about the doll people. He's kind of an unusually kind man because that was made for a more enjoyable story, but she still lives in a world where her race is considered to be an inferior race with cursed souls. So they have to fight against this throughout the whole book. The story ended up being kind of a quest for them to find a place where they could have a true partnership and an equal marriage and like happiness and prosperity. So in the first book, they're still stuck in their homeland where things are quite bad. In the second book, he kind of exploits a loophole in the whole doll person thing, that it is possible for a flesh and blood person to be turned into a doll person, like to save their life if they're mortally wounded or something like that. You can like transfer someone's soul into a artificial body. So he manages to get her like fake papers that she was born a real person. Then he can legally marry her. Because of this lie that they're living under, he takes a job in the capital city very far away from where they started, where they're hoping that no one will really know him or know that she was originally created as a doll person. So we get a different view of the world in book 2. We went from a more just kind of the regular schlubs out in the countryside to the shining capital city where there's like escalated danger because they're around like the major players. They'll be like in really deep shit if the truth is discovered. No surprise that by book 3, they have to escape, and this time they're able to get to the Miralem lands where doll people are considered to not be cursed souls and that slavery is illegal and is terrible. This is like the land of refuge. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is like super welcoming. They still have some struggles with how to fit in, and each book has like a different antagonist that they kind of have to get through. But the first book actually wraps up pretty well. If I was writing it now, I probably would leave a few more threads open at the end of book 1 because sales from book 1 to 2 were not that great. And I think part of it is because book 1 like ends in a pretty decent place for them overall. That was the book on which I first was able to try my hand at writing a whole trilogy that I planned as a trilogy from the start. But things weren't going that well for me writing books set in my actual fantasy world. So then I moved into fantasy and paranormal romance, particularly reverse harem was really hot at the time. Like you could write almost anything that was a reverse harem and it would sell like hotcakes. Reverse harem is a genre that started out in anime and manga. There's both harem and reverse harem. Harem is like one guy and a bunch of girls. Reverse harem is one girl and a bunch of guys. And in anime and manga, it's like a bunch of girls or guys are interested in the protagonist, but in the end there's only one person that they get together with. But over in the indie publishing landscape, people were like, the heck with that. Let's just have the main character get together with all of them and they have to figure out that dynamic. So it became more of like a polyamorous romance genre. My main interest in it was that I thought a lot of the fans might be fans of anime and manga since that was where it came from. And in the beginning, that was somewhat true. And B, it seemed like you could write a lot of different types of guys because you would have like 3 or 4, and I didn't really love like the main tropey guys in paranormal romance. That's not really my thing. I like the weirdos. So I figured if I could write like 4 guys in one book, I could throw in a couple that were more like my thing, along with some of the more obvious like broody or like guys with abs, all that sort of thing. So I was like, all right, I'm going to try my hand at writing reverse harem romance. And leaning on the anime and manga-ish theme of it, my first thought was I'm going to combine 2 properties that I have loved forever. One is Fushigi Yugi, which was kind of a harem-y manga anime that I was obsessed with as a teenager. It was about a girl who gets transported into ancient China via a book and finds out that she is the guardian of Suzaku, which was this kind of phoenixy bird. Or she is the priestess of Suzaku, sorry. She has to find her like 7 guardians and then they have to do like a ritual to summon Suzaku, and she falls in love with one of the guardians, but there's a little bit of romantic tension with some of the other guys. Despite all this romancy stuff, there's like a lot of humor and like adventure and fun side characters. I totally loved this anime and manga. And then another very pivotal story for me as a teenager was the video game Final Fantasy IV. So my thought was, I'm going to write Final Fantasy IV's plot, but as if the party in the video game is the priestess and her guardians. And I'm going to make it smutty because that's what sells. So that was Guardians of Sky and Shadow. Because of the way I had decided to structure it based on Fushigi Yugi and Final Fantasy, that made it kind of easy to plot because I would just look to one of those 2 stories whenever I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And they're also fairly long stories, so that worked out really well for plotting a trilogy. It has elements of both of them that come together throughout the course of the story. Final Fantasy IV is broken up into kind of like 2 different worlds. About at the midway point of the game, they open up this underground world, like under the crust of the earth, where like the dwarves live and the monsters that you can summon in the game, they live down there. There's all these like new places that open up when you get to that world. So that became part of the world building of Guardians of Sky and Shadow, was that there was this underground world that had been sealed off, and that was where the dragons live. And the dragons, of course, can turn into people because, you know, there's got to be a dragon secretly in among her guardians. So this is one way that you can plot a longer book, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with trilogies, is you can look to other stories that you like. Pulling from a couple of different ones at once that you can combine is a great way to do it as far as I'm concerned, because it keeps you from being too derivative of any one story. And I can almost guarantee you that by the time you have taken two different stories, merged them together, and then had to figure out how to do that in your own style, you will have something that is reminiscent of but completely different from the source material. After I wrote Guardians of Sky and Shadow, as you're writing these trilogies, some fresh characters will inevitably end up appearing that you'll be like, this character's interesting. I could write a spin-off with them if I needed to. So there was this princess in the story. Her deal is that her bones were made of crystal, the crystal being an element that's really important in the Dragon Kingdom, because again, this is based on Final Fantasy, which had a heck a lot of crystals. When she was a child, she had to swallow the dragon's tear, which was a magical crystal that turned her bones to crystal, and she became really fragile and sickly, and the only way to turn her bones back into bones is for her to marry the Dragon King, and when they consummate the marriage, she will be healed. That became the setup for the second trilogy that was a spin-off of Guardians of Sky and Shadow. I couldn't quite pull from Final Fantasy IV or anymore because that plot had run its course. I just had to come up with something new. And honestly, I don't know how I plotted this trilogy. I started rereading it in order to make this video because I remember it being a really involved plot. Despite the goofiness of reverse harem fantasy, I'm still kind of impressed with this series. I was writing 10 books a year at this point, so every book was written really quickly, just banging them out, commercial writing. And to me, wow, these books are still pretty good. They were kind of the test run for the books I'm working on currently, which are a little more serious fantasy. But you'll see a lot of similar elements, things that were already existing in the Hidden Lands world that I'm writing about now that I pulled into this book just to kind of you might as well recycle some ideas. And then also some ideas that I took from Kingdoms of Sky and Shadow, particularly the idea of the sickly, cursed princessy type. Himika in Kingdoms ended up becoming similar to Tasha in The Broken Queen. This plot started getting so involved that I know that I had to end up writing all these different character and plot arcs down on index cards and sorting them all out in this big stack of things that had to happen. I had to be very, the first book I was winging it a little bit, and then I had to sit down and get really organized if I was going to wrap everything up. One good thing about a arranged marriage trope is that you have a lot of plot just for the first book of here's your new husband, here's your new kingdom, you have to adjust to this whole new court, new life, new attendants, new friends, new cultural mores. That can take up the first book almost entirely. So there's a big setup book, but it doesn't feel draggy or boring because there's a lot going on, and generally there's some kind of villain lurking in the background. I had somewhat of a watershed thought with this book, which was that I realized that I had often been writing books based on just general themes that everybody writes, the kind of themes that you see in Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and all the classic fantasy spec fic epics that everybody kind of goes back to. One of the ones that appears a lot is the idea of here's the good king, he's gonna fix everything, he needs to be restored to his throne, we found him in the guise of a farm boy, or it could be a queen, we found her hidden away. That's such a common trope to have the lost king or queen in fantasy. And it's not like I'm the only person to ever subvert the trope. But in the course of this book, I started thinking I've written that trope. Why have I written that trope? Because I don't really want to be governed by a king. I'm more of a fan of democracy. It doesn't always work as we hoped, but generally I want to be able to vote and choose my leaders. So in a broad sense, this was the book where I started to think a little more deeply about whether my books were grappling with things I actually believed in and whether they felt relevant to me and that the things that were going on in my own life and in society currently. This has had a ripple effect across many other books since, that I've dealt with more things that feel pertinent ever since I wrote Kingdoms of Sky and Shadow. And I've often questioned when I'm writing my books, like, do I actually believe in this thing? Do I actually think that this is the best way to live? Is this the best outcome? Is this the message I want to send? Just having that thought has changed a lot of future books. So just like a general note, not really about writing trilogies, but kind of just a revelation that came to me while writing Kingdoms. So at the end of the first book in the Kingdom series, the characters find out that the man that they thought was the Dragon King who's going to heal Himika from her crystal bones, he is not the true king, but he has been a very good king. So it starts to grapple with the idea in the mind of the protagonist, who is herself royalty, as, does the bloodline actually mean anything? Should I be fighting to keep the king as the king, or do we need to restore the true king to the throne? And that ends up being kind of the theme for the whole series, is questioning the idea of, like, is the person with royal blood actually the best man for the job? And if not, then how do we resolve this because we have a monarchy? After that, I wrote The Surrender of Sleeping Beauty, which went totally different direction. That was more of like a dark fairy tale retelling. Very, very steamy. And it was based on a mashup of Marie Antoinette's real life and the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale. Because it was based on the real life of Marie Antoinette, which I researched so heavily that you will actually learn real facts about Marie Antoinette reading my spicy fairy tale. Marie Antoinette's life has 3 very obvious different segments. There's the part when she first comes to the court and she marries Louis XVI, but Louis XV is still the reigning king, and she's dealing with, like, you know, little petty court intrigues and people who aren't sure that they like her, and she's young and she's being pressured to have an heir, and she's, you know, dealing with the French court for the first time. Then there's the part where she is the queen, the let them eat cake icon that Marie Antoinette is known for being. I mean, she didn't actually say that, but she was somewhat slandered in the press of the time, and then she was kind of living her best life in some cases with her friends at the Petite Trianon, and it is thought that she might have had a little side affair. Anyway, that's like peak queen life. And then there's the revolution burgeoning, the fall of Marie Antoinette. This was a very easy way to plot a trilogy because her real life just happened to have such an easy flow for a trilogy. So much like I drew on Final Fantasy and Fushigi Yugi for Guardians, in this case I drew on some history. So sometimes if you're having trouble plotting a trilogy, find something you can draw on, whether it's real or another story. Then I wrote A Witch Among Warlocks, which perfectly hit the reverse harem academy trend that was popping off at this point. That was 2019, and I hit that trend just right by pure accident. And the concept of this book is that there's a magic school, kind of like Hogwarts, where you get an invitation to it, and this girl gets an invitation, but it is a school for warlocks, and she's a witch. And so there's this question throughout the book of, how did I, a girl, end up getting invited to a school for boys? And the magical world in this book is very sexist, so there's kind of this plot of breaking down this, like, very traditionalist mindset of the magical world throughout the book, and it's also very steamy. This is my first time writing, like, real, like, paranormal romance, where you got your witches, your vampires, your werewolves, demons, all the, like, basic paranormal things. And one thing about writing paranormal romance is that, like, I feel like it's a little more wacky than, like, epic fantasy. I feel like paranormal romance has this element of, like, this is all kind of goofy, right? You can play around with it. At least that was the mindset that I went into. So I don't think that I plotted this very thoroughly. I based the romance a little bit on the manga Boys Over Flowers, and then I had a few Harry Potter-ish elements throughout. But generally I just let the story evolve in whatever kind of, like, wacky way I felt like, and it didn't feel that important to plot it in a super serious way. But even when you're just kind of letting things evolve in like a, what the heck, there's a fairy world. Oh, sure, there's like a reform school for wizards. Why not? We'll end up, they get sent there. It's dangerous. You know, just all these kind of different goofy elements that would pop up. I still tried to keep a couple of overarching plots. Every main character has like their own core struggle that carries them through. So no matter what different antagonists and twists and turns I ended up coming with along the way, I could always go back to that core struggle that each character was facing. So one of the things for the main character is that she never knew her mom. She finds out that her mom is like, has joined the dark side. She's got to figure out how to save her mom. And then when she does save her mom, she has to grapple with the fact that, like, here's her dad, who was a normal human, and now his wife is back and she's been spending time with demons. Like, you gotta deal with that. And also every guy in the harem had kind of their own plot arc as well. So if you're gonna kind of just like go with the flow and write just some wacky madcap paranormal adventure, I still think it's good to sit down first and come up with like an overarching core desire and need and struggle for every character that's going to be a main character. That way, no matter what you think of along the way, you can keep reverting back to that, and it will give some cohesion to the plot. Follow up to this book, Finishing School for Fairy Brides. That was similarly plotted with just like, let's see where this goes, and it went all kinds of silly directions. That one was really just like a straight up comedy at that point. I leaned into just like the comedic side that I was having a lot of fun. Oh, sorry, the cat keeps knocking around the... There was a fair amount of comedy in the Paranormal Magic School story, so I just leaned into that. I just had like a goofy, fun time. But again, keeping to those core character needs and wants and ways that they need to change to achieve their goals, basic plot structures that arc across 3 books. Then I wrote Forever in Their Thrall. That was another spin-off of this paranormal world, but it went a lot darker. I went from like goofy to dark, which I make a lot of bad marketing decisions, what can I say? But this book really had like one very bad villain that they had to deal with, and that kind of drove the plot forward. It had a reincarnation plotline where the main character is unable to be turned into a vampire, but she is in love with a man who got turned into a vampire, and every time she's been reincarnated, he finds her in different guises, even different genders, different parts of the world. Their romance is rekindled, but he keeps trying to find a way to actually turn her into a vampire so that they can just be together and not deal with all this ever-changing identity stuff. In this life, she is a witch in a magical cult with a magical cult leader. I did a lot of research on cults, probably too much. I think that I made the cult so unsettlingly realistic that some readers found it just way too dark. And then the vampires themselves were like kind of messed up. I feel like if you're going to write vampires, they should be a little messed up. That's just my thing with vampires. I don't know. I feel like it'd be kind of a psychologically difficult life, but that might be when your first vampire novel is Interview with the Vampire. That was kind of that was the mood I was leaning into. It was not a Twilight vampire. It was definitely more of an Interview with the Vampire type harem. So the first book in that series is basically just getting her out of the cult and rescuing her and telling her the deal, like, hey, we're your vampire lovers. The second book is like a book of like that concept evolving, and they discover the truth about the cult leader, that he's the man who has prevented her from being a vampire, and that their history goes back all the way to the beginning. And she finds out about her past lives. The second book is basically all just like the discovery, and they travel around the world to the locations of her past lives, and you know, there's a lot going on. And then the third book is basically the whole resolution of defeating the cult. And then I wrote Paranormal House Flippers. Totally different structure for this one. The idea was that I was watching a lot of house flipping shows, and I thought, it'd be fun to write a book based on house flipping shows, but all the houses are like magical. The protagonist of this book was the sister of one of the characters in the original Paranormal University book. She was from a wealthy witch family, but she wanted to do her own thing, so she decided to just go out on her own and flip houses for a living. I had a lot of fun playing off of all the HGTV shows that were extremely hot at this time in like 2021. It was a pandemic book. You know what? We were all stuck at home watching HGTV and I was writing this. So this structure, of course, suggested to me that each book was going to be about flipping a different house in a different city, a different historical house with a different vibe, and it would each house would have like its own magical secret, and each magical secret would tie into a puzzle, a magical problem that stretched across all 3 books. So in the first house was like an old house in rural Pennsylvania. All the main players get introduced and she finds this ghost that's trapped in the house, and he can't tell her all the truth, but she starts to uncover the pieces and finds that to like get the next piece of the puzzle of like what's his deal, she has to go to this other house. Basically all the houses belong to this ghost's friends and they've all died, but he's stuck earthbound as a ghost. So the next book the house is in is like a old like plantation-y style house in Louisiana. And then in the third book they get a very 70s swinging house in California. And a lot of the plot is just lighthearted, like discovering the house, talking about how they're going to fix up the house, like the beats of an HGTV episode, and then there'd also be the secret that each house contained and like some twists and turns from, you know, outer complications. You had your rival house flippers who would try to buy the house out from under them. You had the local vampire who, you know, starts poking his nose into it. You know, I just kind of throw in some fairly lighthearted conflicts, but tie it all together with this one overarching thing. So that's one way to do sort of like a hybrid of like an episodic story and more of a coherent series, is if you can think of like each book has like a different X, but then there's one plot that ties them all together. And then there's one more series that I wrote in that paranormal world, but that one kind of flopped and I don't really remember what happens in it very well because I was getting very exhausted of writing paranormal reverse harem, so I'm not going to get into that one. And now, of course, I've left the commercial romance world behind and I'm back to working on the Hidden Lands books, same world as that first trilogy, Cursed Soul trilogy, and I am now writing 2 different trilogies at once, and they're all intertwined in this one big plot. You do not have to read the whole plot, but there are a lot of characters and elements that cross between the books. What I wanted it to be is the kind of story where you can jump in anywhere, but if you did want to read the whole story, you would be rewarded with a lot of like little Easter eggs and crossovers and appearances of characters that you might have thought you were never going to see again, and here they are. I love that kind of thing. I have mixed feelings about like the Marvel universe, both in comic and movie form, and the way that it never seems to end. It's just a lot to deal with, and there's been like so many different change-ups and different writers and artists and even directors on the movie side. But I do really love the way that you're rewarded the more deep you get into it, the more you start to see those little like, oh, well, yeah, this character, oh, now they're back, and like the little bits of lore, little call outs, like that's so fun as a fan that I wanted to take those elements that I loved when I was younger about like a big sprawling comic book universe and pack them into one story that I could manage to tell. And these books are taking longer. They're more important to me. I really want them to be good, and I have a lot of things that I need to juggle and think through as I'm writing them. But I will say that my time writing the romance books, the fact that I wrote so many trilogies in such a short amount of time, I didn't fuss that much over whether they were good, but they were so important to my development, because I think that if I had just been trying to write them in like a more, you know, like for traditional publishing, or if I'd tried to start by writing the fantasy world that means so much to me, I would have been extremely intimidated and paralyzed, because writing a trilogy is a lot, especially when you're not super experienced writer. So the great thing about my time writing all of these reverse harem fantasy and paranormal trilogies is that it just freed me up. because people just were hungry for reverse harem at the time that they were coming out. You didn't have to be that good to sell books and have fans. And as a result, I ended up writing some really good material during these years. I wasn't fussing over it. I just leveled up like crazy. And some of the stuff I wrote ended up being really good. Some of it wasn't. Some of it was bad. But looking back, I learned so much by just churning out stuff that I didn't stop to fuss over very much. Just forced myself to move forward and just execute these 3-book series. And then how was I going to intertwine them to keep the fans that I was getting? So there might be a lesson in that too. Like, just do it. Another interesting thing about reverse harem, just as an aside, is they're actually pretty difficult books to write well. And you can see that in what was published because it was really hard to find like a really good one. Writing a reverse harem that actually follows like the structure of a story that you would learn in like a writing class, where each character has like flaws, goals, things they struggle against, things they want and need. Actually executing a book that has like 4 to 6 main characters, and then when you're writing it as a paranormal or a fantasy, you're also expected to throw in like some kind of political intrigue or some kind of like big action plot that envelops over the course of 3 books. That's actually really hard. So I'm kind of glad that I was in that space for a little while, because it was like I really tried to make them good, and I didn't always succeed, but I really leveled up as far as like now when I'm sitting down to write like the real books that I've been waiting to write for so long. I feel so much more confident about it. I mean, not perfectly confident, but so much more confident than when I started in my career, because I've kind of pinned myself against the wall. Like, you got to get it done. You've got a deadline. You don't know what you're doing, but you got to figure it out quickly, and just like writing so many books. Now I kind of feel like I know the rhythm of a trilogy, and I know that I can always figure it out. So the lesson there is maybe like, just do it. Just do it. So that is all my experience in writing trilogies so far. And I know I talked a lot about my books, which I try to go general as much as I can when I'm making these videos, but every trilogy is so different. I can see why there's not a lot of material about how to write a trilogy in particular, because there's some basic advice you can follow, but so much of it just kind of has to evolve organically when you're dealing with such a long story. So I felt like the best way to do it was just to like talk you through some of my trilogies. I hope that you've gotten some different like little things throughout this video to spark your ideas for how to write a trilogy. And if you have any questions about writing trilogies or any kind of length of series, let me know. Or if you've learned anything about writing trilogies, for those of you who already have writing experience, you know, I love all those kind of comments. If you'd like to read any of my books, there is a link in the description below. And be sure to check out Magic Mind using my code FOXGLOVE20 with the link below. If you'd like more from me, I have a Substack and a Patreon. Same content on both. They both have a free tier, and the $5 tier gets you access to my Discord server and 2 bonus videos every month. I also have YouTube memberships turned on if you just want the bonus videos, and those are voted on by members, and I would love to see you there. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye! Hey, you got it!